7 crew members were inserted by helicopter into the upper Slough Creek drainage of Yellowstone National Park on August 19, 2003. The deployment was classified as a Class B fire suppression response, a small lightning strike ignition in a drainage that does not appear on the park's primary fire response grid. The fire had been flagged by Landsat thermal imaging 18 hours earlier. By the time the crew reached the ignition point, the fire was out. 4 of the 7 were evacuated by helicopter over the following 48 hours. All 4 were diagnosed with acute stress reactions. The clinical language on the medevac forms reads, non-responsive, catatonic affect, selective mutism. None of the 4 had any prior psychiatric history. None had fewer than 6 years of wildland fire experience. The youngest was 28. The remaining 3 hiked out on August 22nd. They reached the Slough Creek trailhead at 1340 hours, 11 miles from their assigned extraction point. None of them have filed an incident report. None have filed a workers' compensation claim. None have filed a lawsuit. The fire does not appear in the National Interagency Fire Center Suppression Database. The helicopter sorties do not appear in the park's aviation log. I know this because I was the crew leader. My name is Thomas Hale. I was 41 years old when I walked into that drainage. I am 61 now, and I am recording this from a room at the VA Medical Center in Billings, Montana, where I'm being treated for an illness that will kill me before the year is out. I have no reason to lie. I have no time to be diplomatic. And I have spent 20 years waiting for someone in the Park Service to tell the truth about what is in that drainage. They will not. So I will. I will not tell you what I think is in the upper Slough Creek. I will tell you what I saw, what I measured, and what walked us out of there on the 3rd night. I will tell you about a document the Park Service has denied exists for 45 years. And I will tell you why 7 men went into a drainage that should have been a 4-hour assignment, and why not one of them was the same when they came out. But I need you to understand something first. The thing we found in that drainage, the thing that found us, it did not hurt anyone. Not one scratch, not one bruise, not one drop of blood. 4 men lost the ability to speak, and 3 men lost the ability to sleep, and none of that was violence. It was proximity. The National Park Service's account of what happened in the upper Slough Creek drainage between August 19th and August 22nd of 2003 is 4 sentences long. I know because I requested it through the Freedom of Information Act in 2009, and again in 2014, and a 3rd time in 2019. Each time, the same 4 sentences came back on NPS letterhead, unsigned, with a case reference number that leads nowhere in the federal records system. The statement reads, on August 19, 2003, a 7-person fire suppression crew was deployed to the upper Slough Creek drainage in response to a satellite-detected thermal event. The crew was extracted on August 20th to 22nd due to deteriorating weather conditions. No fire suppression action was required. The thermal event resolved naturally. Every sentence in that statement is a lie, and I can prove it because I kept the weather data. August 19th through 22nd, 2003, in the northern range of Yellowstone, was a high-pressure system, clear skies, daytime temperatures between 71 and 76 degrees Fahrenheit, overnight lows in the mid-40s, wind speeds below 8 miles per hour, relative humidity between 14 and 22%. I have the National Weather Service archived readings from the Tower Falls station, 9 miles from our insertion point. There was no deteriorating weather. There was no weather event of any kind. The sky was glass for 4 straight days. The thermal event did not resolve naturally. Thermal events in that fuel-type mature lodgepole pine with 30 years of accumulated deadfall do not self-extinguish under 14% humidity with an 8-mile-per-hour wind. I have fought fire in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for 19 seasons. A lightning strike in those conditions, in that fuel load, burns until it runs out of fuel or until someone puts it out. It does not go out on its own. That is not how fire works. and 4 men were not extracted due to weather. 4 men were extracted because they could no longer speak, could no longer make eye contact, and in one case, could no longer stand. I watched them loaded onto the helicopter. I watched the flight medic check their pupils and find them responsive but fixed, tracking nothing, focused on nothing, staring at a point approximately 6 feet in front of their faces as if something were standing there that the rest of us could not see. The official version does not mention any of this. The official version does not mention the fire crew's names, their duty station, their supervisor, or the nature of the thermal event they were sent to investigate. It does not mention that the drainage they were inserted into had been removed from the park's active trail maintenance map in 1981 and had never been restored. It does not mention that the helicopter pilot, a contract aviator named Ray Segura, who had been flying Yellowstone operations for 11 years, told me on the radio during the second evacuation that he had never been asked to fly into that drainage before, and that his GPS showed no landing zone data for it, meaning no one had ever programmed one, meaning no helicopter had ever been planned for that airspace, meaning we were the first crew sent in there, or we were supposed to be the last, or both. I have the weather data. I have the medevac timestamps. I have my own field notes, written in a waterproof notebook that I have kept in a safe deposit box in Billings since September 2003. And I have a document that the Park Service says does not exist, a document I will tell you about later, because it changes what happened to us from an unexplained incident into something worse. It changes it into a pattern. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I am not a paranormal investigator. I am a GS-9 crew leader with 19 years of federal wildland fire service, a Type 2 incident commander qualification, and a back full of titanium screws from a tree strike in the Bitterroot in 1997 that has nothing to do with this story, except to tell you that I am not a man who startles easily. I have been burned. I have been buried. I have been closer to dying from falling timber than most people will ever be to dying from anything. What I encountered in the upper Slough Creek drainage in August 2003 was not the most dangerous thing I've survived, but it is the only thing I cannot explain. On the morning of August 19th, the helicopter set us down in a meadow at 7,400 feet elevation, approximately 2 miles south-southwest of the Landsat thermal signature. The meadow was not a designated landing zone. Ray Segura picked it from the air based on openness and slope angle, because, as I have said, no landing zone existed in the system for this drainage. He put the skids down at 0740 hours, and we offloaded 7 crew members and 4 days of supplies in under 6 minutes. The crew was myself, Thomas Hale, crew leader, Paul Duran, squad boss, 12 years of service, based out of West Yellowstone, Keith Oberlin, our sawyer, 20 years in, the oldest man on the crew at 46, and the quietest by a margin that made the rest of us seem like we were shouting. Miguel Reyes, our crow liaison and cultural resource monitor, attached to the crew because the drainage fell within a consultation boundary with the Absolute Nation. Danny Macklin, engine operator cross-trained for hand crew, 22 years old, first backcountry fire deployment. Aaron Pruitt, EMTB and crew medic, 9 years in. And Joseph Waits, our second sawyer, who had transferred from the Shoshone National Forest 4 months earlier and had not yet been on a Yellowstone operation. I list their names and their qualifications because the official version does not, and because what happened to them deserves to be attached to people who were real, who were competent, and who did nothing wrong. We moved south-southwest from the meadow in a standard approach column, following the drainage upslope toward the thermal signature. The terrain was what I expected for upper Slough Creek dense lodgepole stands. Heavy deadfall, moderate slope, elk trails threading through the undergrowth, but no maintained path. We were off trail from the first step. The GPS had us on a bearing of 214 degrees magnetic, and I had marked the Landsat coordinates on my topo map the night before. The first thing I noticed was the silence. But I want to be precise about that, because silence in the backcountry is not unusual, and I do not want to dramatize what does not need dramatizing. Yellowstone in August is not quiet. Clark's nutcrackers, red squirrels, the occasional raven, elk moving through timber, the background hum of insects in the warming air. What I registered at approximately 08:30, 45 minutes into our approach march, was not the absence of all sound. It was the absence of animal sound. Wind still moved through the canopy. Our boots still cracked deadfall. But the layer of biological noise that sits on top of a living forest, the layer you stop hearing because it is always there, was gone. I noted it. I did not mention it to the crew. Keith Oberlin, who noticed everything and mentioned nothing, caught my eye and held it for a moment that told me he had registered the same thing. Neither of us spoke about it. In 19 years of firework, I have walked into plenty of drainages where the wildlife has vacated ahead of smoke, ahead of human scent, ahead of helicopter rotor wash. There are rational explanations for a quiet forest. I applied one and moved on. We reached the fire site at 11:20 hours, 3 hours and 40 minutes after insertion. The fire was out. I had expected that. Dispatch had noted the thermal signature was fading on the second Landsat pass. What I had not expected was what surrounded the ignition point. The lightning strike had hit a single lodgepole pine at the center of a small clearing. I could see the spiral scar running down the trunk, the characteristic corkscrew pattern of a direct strike, the bark blown out in a radius of about 4 feet at the base. The tree was dead. The ground around it was charred in a circle approximately 20 feet in diameter. Standard. Unremarkable. I have seen 100 lightning strike ignitions, and this one looked like all of them, except that it had stopped burning in conditions where it should not have stopped burning. But the clearing was wrong. It was too large. The charred circle was 20 feet across. The clearing was closer to 90. And the trees at the edge of the clearing, mature lodgepoles, 60 to 70 feet tall, 12 to 18 inches in diameter at breast height, were not standing where lodgepole pines grow. They had been moved. I need you to understand what I mean by that, because the word moved does not capture what I was looking at. 14 trees, I counted them twice, had been pulled from the ground with their root balls intact and repositioned upright in a rough circle around the lightning strike site. The root balls were exposed, soil still clinging to them, the dirt dark and moist, meaning the displacement was recent days, not weeks. The holes where the trees had originally stood were visible, raw craters of disturbed earth, each one approximately 8 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep, spaced between 40 and 60 feet from their current positions. Someone, or something, had pulled 14 full-grown lodgepole pines out of the ground, like fence posts, and replanted them in a circle. Keith Oberlin walked to the nearest repositioned tree and put his hand on the trunk. He looked at the base, where the root ball met the soil. He looked at the hole where the tree had been. He looked at me. "Microburst," he said. Keith had been a sawyer for 20 years. He knew timber the way I knew fire. He wanted it to be a microburst, a localized downdraft that can snap and scatter trees in a concentrated area. I wanted it to be a microburst too. But microbursts do not pull trees out of the ground with their root systems intact. Microbursts snap trunks at the base or uproot trees and throw them laterally. They do not replant them upright in a geometric pattern. And microbursts leave a debris field, shattered limbs, stripped bark, scattered canopy. There was no debris field. The trees were intact. Every branch, every needle cluster. The bark was unmarked, except for a series of vertical gouges on the trunks at approximately 15 to 20 feet above ground level long. Parallel scores, 4 at a time, each about 3/4 of an inch wide and 1/4 inch deep, running vertically down the trunk for about 2 feet. I measured them. I always measure. I have a forester's diameter tape and a 6-inch folding ruler that I carry on every deployment, and I used both. The gouges were consistent across all 14 trees. Same spacing, same depth, same height, same grouping 4 parallel marks, consistent with 4 digits of something that gripped the trunks at a height of 15 to 20 feet while pulling them from the earth. Keith saw the gouges. He did not say microburst again. He did not say anything. He touched the inside of one of the gouges with his index finger, and he looked at the raw wood inside it. And he put his hand down and walked back to where the rest of the crew was standing. Paul Duran asked me what I wanted to do. I told him we would document the site, take photographs, record GPS coordinates, and make camp a quarter-mile north to await further instructions from dispatch. That was the correct procedural decision. It was also the decision that kept us in that drainage for 3 more days. I have thought about that decision every night for 20 years. I need to leave the drainage for a moment and tell you about a document. In 2011, 8 years after the Slough Creek deployment, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the National Park Service for any internal correspondence, memoranda, or policy documents referencing the upper Slough Creek drainage that predated the year 2000. I was not specific about what I was looking for. I did not mention the fire, the crew, or what we had found. I asked only for historical administrative records related to that drainage. The request took 14 months to process. What came back was a partial release. 114 pages, of which 47 were fully redacted, and another 31 were partially redacted. The remaining 36 pages were mostly routine. Trail maintenance schedules from the 1970s, a 1969 wildlife census that counted elk in the drainage, the last census to do so, which I will return to, and budgetary documents related to backcountry cabin upkeep. But in the middle of the release, between a 1975 trail condition report and a 1980 facilities decommissioning notice, there were 4 pages that were not routine. The document is dated November 12, 1978. It is printed on NPS internal letterhead from the Yellowstone Superintendent's office. It is titled Biological Exclusion Protocol, Upper Slough Creek Drainage, Sector 7-NE. It is signed by the acting superintendent, a man named Harold Kemper, who served in that capacity from 1977 to 1982, and who died in 1994. The document establishes a permanent exclusion zone in the upper Slough Creek drainage. It prohibits all trail maintenance, all recreational permitting, all scientific research access, and all fire suppression activity within the zone without direct authorization from the superintendent's office. The exclusion is not framed as a geological hazard, a wildlife protection measure, or a cultural resource boundary. It is framed as a response to what the document calls an indigenous identified territorial entity of unknown taxonomy, confirmed by direct observation on 3 occasions. The 3 occasions are listed. November 1923, a 2-person geological survey team reported an animal of extraordinary size, bipedal, antlered, standing among timber at the head of the drainage, and withdrew without incident. June 1951, a 4-person trail maintenance crew reported ground vibration, displacement of mature timber, and visual contact with a large unidentified animal at approximately 200 yards. And was extracted by packhorse. October 1978. The incident that triggered the protocol, a 3-person wildlife census team conducting the annual elk count, reported sustained visual contact at close range with, and I'm reading directly from the document now, a bipedal entity of estimated height 7 to 9 meters, skeletal in apparent morphology, bearing antler-like cranial structures of a type and scale not consistent with any known North American cervid species. The 1978 team was in the field for 6 hours after the contact. All 3 members completed their extraction without physical injury. 2 of the 3 requested transfers to other parks within the year. The third, the team leader, filed the report that became the basis for the Biological Exclusion Protocol. The document's recommendations are brief. Maintain the exclusion zone indefinitely. Do not attempt capture, tracking, or further observation. Do not publicize. Coordinate with Apsaluka and Eastern Shoshone tribal authorities to ensure the exclusion zone aligns with traditional avoidance boundaries. And the final line, which I have read more times than I can count. Previous contact incidents, 1923, 1951, 1978. Casualties, 0. Recommendation: maintain exclusion. Do not engage. It will manage the contact. It will manage the contact. When I received this document, I called the FOIA office in Washington and asked to speak with the reviewing officer. I wanted to confirm authenticity. I wanted to ask why a document establishing a permanent biological exclusion zone in a major national park had been classified as a draft and never entered into the official policy record. The reviewing officer told me the document was an unverified internal draft with no official standing, and that the FOIA office could not confirm or deny its authenticity. She then told me that the upper Slough Creek drainage had been closed to public access since 1981 for resource management purposes, which was the same language used on every trail closure sign I had ever seen in Yellowstone, and which means nothing, and which means everything. I did not know about this document when I walked into that drainage in 2003. I did not know about the 1923 survey team, or the 1951 trail crew, or the 1978 census team. I did not know that the exclusion zone existed, because the exclusion zone was never entered into the system that generates fire dispatch assignments. Whoever programmed the Landsat thermal response grid in the 1990s either did not know about the Hayden File, which is what I have come to call it, after the original Hayden Geological Survey of 1871 that first mapped this part of Yellowstone, or did not think a 45-year-old document about an unidentified biological entity was relevant to fire suppression. We were sent into a drainage that 3 separate teams had entered over 55 years, and every one of those teams had encountered the same thing. And every one of those teams had come out with 0 casualties. And someone in 1978 had written a protocol to make sure no one was ever sent in again. And then we were sent in again. I'm telling you about the Hayden File now, before I tell you what happened on the 2nd and 3rd nights, because I need you to understand that what we experienced was not new. It was not random. It was not a freak encounter with an unknown animal in an unexpected place. It was the 4th recorded contact in 80 years, and the pattern was the same every time. A small team enters the drainage. The entity makes contact. The team withdraws. No one is physically harmed. The only thing that changes is the people. The entity does not change. The drainage does not change. The boundary does not move. We were not the first. We were the first who were not supposed to be there. On the evening of August 19th, after we had documented the fire site and established camp a quarter-mile north of the clearing, Miguel Reyes sat down next to me at the cook fire and told me a story. Miguel was 34 years old, Apsaluk, born and raised in Lodge Grass on the Crow Reservation, 60 miles northeast of where we were sitting. He had been attached to our crew as a cultural resource monitor standard procedure when fire operations fall within a tribal consultation boundary, which this drainage did. Miguel's job was to flag any cultural sites, burial markers, or sacred features that the crew might encounter during suppression work, and to advise me if our operations risked disturbing anything that required tribal notification. In practice, Miguel was a firefighter who happened to also be the only person on the crew who had any reason to know what this drainage meant. He told me he had not wanted to say anything during the day because he was not sure it was relevant, and because he did not want to be the Indian telling ghost stories to a fire crew. He said that, with a half smile that was not quite a smile, and I understood what it cost him to say it. And I told him that anything he knew about this drainage was operationally relevant to me, and that I wanted to hear it. Miguel said that among the Apsaluk, the upper Slough Creek drainage was not a place with a story. It was a place with a standing instruction. The instruction, as he had received it from his grandfather, and as his grandfather had received it from men who had walked this country before the park existed, before the treaty boundaries were drawn, before the name Yellowstone was ever spoken in English, was simple and without ambiguity. You do not go there. You do not hunt there. You do not camp there. You do not follow game into it. If you are on the ridge above, and you look down into it, you do not linger on the ridge. The drainage belongs to something that was there before the Absolute and will be there after. The Absolute word Miguel used, and he said it once, quietly, and did not repeat it, translates roughly as the one who tends the burning ground. I asked him what that meant. He said the elders described it as a keeper, not a predator, not a spirit in the way that white people understand the word, but a physical thing, alive, old, enormous, that occupies the drainage the way a rancher occupies a fenced pasture. It does not leave. It does not wander. It tends. It manages. The burning ground, Miguel said, was not a reference to fire specifically. It was a reference to the land itself, land that the Apsaluka understood to be active, volcanic, alive beneath the surface in ways that required tending. I asked him if the elders described what the keeper looked like. Miguel paused for a long time before answering. The fire-popped Aaron Pruitt across the cook ring was pretending not to listen but had stopped eating. Miguel said the descriptions varied in detail but not in kind. Tall, taller than the timber. Bones visible, as if the flesh had been stripped away or had never been there. Antlers like an elk, but wrong too many points, too wide, asymmetrical in a way that elk antlers are not. It walks upright. It does not run. It does not need to. I asked Miguel if the elders had a word for what it does when people enter the drainage. He said, "It tends. It does not take. It is always tended." I wrote that in my field notebook. I wrote the date next to it, August 19th, 2003, approximately 20-30 hours. I filed it in my mind the way I filed everything Miguel told me as cultural context, as consultation material, as something I would include in my post-deployment report under tribal coordination notes. I did not file it as operational intelligence. I did not change our camp location. I did not radio dispatch to request extraction. I had 14 moved trees and a set of claw marks I could not identify. And I had an indigenous oral tradition describing a territorial entity in the drainage where I was camped. And I treated the moved trees as an anomaly, and the oral tradition as context, because that is what I was trained to do, and because I was not yet ready to allow those two categories to merge into a single conclusion. Miguel watched me write in my notebook, and did not say anything else. But before he stood up to go to his tent, he said one more thing. He said his grandfather had told him that the keeper does not harm people, that in all the generations of the Apsaluk avoiding the drainage, there was no account of anyone being killed or injured by the keeper. The avoidance was not based on danger. It was based on respect. You do not walk into another man's house, Miguel said, even if he will not hurt you for it. He went to his tent. I sat by the fire for another hour, listening to the silence and the drainage around us, and I thought about the Hayden File, which I would not learn about for another 8 years. And I thought about 3 prior contact teams who had walked into this drainage and walked out again with 0 casualties. And I did not yet know that I was the 4th, and I did not yet know that the pattern would hold. But I knew, sitting there, that the fire had not gone out on its own. Something had put it out, something that tended the burning ground. Before dawn on the 20th, Joseph Waits stopped speaking. I need to describe this precisely, because stopped speaking is not the same as chose not to speak, and the difference matters. Joseph Waits was a sawyer, a man who ran a chainsaw and heavy timber for a living, who communicated constantly with his swamper about hazard trees and escape routes and the direction of the next cut. Sawyers are not quiet men in the field. They cannot afford to be. Joseph Waits in particular was a man who talked through his thinking, who narrated his own risk assessments aloud, who was, by the accounting of everyone who had ever worked with him, physiologically incapable of prolonged silence. At 05:30 on August 20th, Aaron Pruitt woke me and said Joseph was sitting on a log near the fire ring, fully dressed, boots laced, hard hat on, staring at the tree line to the south of the direction of the clearing we had documented the day before and had not responded to his name, to physical touch on the shoulder, or to Aaron shining a headlamp in his eyes. I went to Joseph. He was breathing normally. His pupils were equal and reactive. His pulse was 72. He was not catatonic in the clinical sense. His eyes tracked movement. He blinked. He shifted his weight on the log. But he would not speak. He would not look at me. He would fixated on the tree line with an expression I can only describe as attentive. Not afraid, not blank, attentive. As though he were listening to something that required his complete concentration. And my voice was an interruption he had decided to ignore. Aaron's field assessment was acute stress reaction, possibly triggered by the anomalous site conditions and the altitude. It was a reasonable diagnosis. It was wrong, but it was reasonable. And I accepted it, because the alternative was to accept that something in the darkness before dawn had reached into my Sawyer's mind and turned off the part of him that made words. I radioed dispatch at 0600 and requested a medical evacuation for one crew member. The helicopter Ray Segura again arrived at 0740 and extracted Joseph from the meadow where we had been inserted the day before. Joseph walked to the helicopter under his own power. He sat in the seat. He buckled the harness. He did not speak. He did not look back at us. He looked south, toward the drainage, until the helicopter banked east and the angle took it from his sight. Danny Macklin, who was standing next to me as the helicopter lifted off, said, "He wasn't scared, Hale. Did you see his face?" He wasn't scared. I had seen his face. Danny was right. Joseph Waits had not looked frightened. He had looked like a man who had been given an instruction he could not refuse. On the afternoon of the 20th, Keith Oberlin went down. Keith was stronger than Joseph's. Keith was stronger than most things. He had been cutting timber since before I'd started fighting fire, and he had a Sawyer's Constitution patient, methodical, almost impossible to rattle. Keith did not go silent. Keith went still. At approximately 14:30 hours, while the remaining 6 of us were conducting a wider survey of the clearing perimeter, I had decided to extend our documentation radius to look for additional evidence of the displacement pattern. Keith stopped walking. He was 40 feet ahead of me on the south side of the clearing, near one of the repositioned trees, and he stopped as if he had walked into a wall. I called his name. He did not respond. I walked to him. He was standing with his arms at his sides, his head tilted approximately 15 degrees to the right, and he was looking up, not at the canopy, above the canopy, at a point in the air approximately 30 feet above the ground where there was nothing. I stood next to him, and I looked where he was looking, and I saw nothing: trees, sky, the flat gray of high overcast that had moved in since morning. Keith's lips were moving. I leaned in close enough to hear. He was saying one word over and over, very quietly, at a rhythm that did not match normal speech. The word was there, 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 as if he were confirming something's location for someone who had asked. Aaron assessed him. Same vitals as Joseph, stable, responsive to light, normal pulse. Not catatonic, not panicked, just elsewhere. Aaron used the word dissociative in his field notes, and I think that was closer to the truth than acute stress. But I also think the truth was not in Aaron's medical vocabulary, because the truth was that something in that clearing was communicating with my crew in a way that bypassed language and arrived directly in the part of the brain that language comes from. And when it arrived, language stopped. I radioed for a second evacuation. Keith was extracted at 16:30 hours. He walked to the helicopter. He sat down. He buckled in. He looked south. That night, the night of the 20th, two more went down. Paul Duran and Aaron Pruitt. Paul first at approximately 2200 hours. Aaron 40 minutes later. Paul woke the camp with a sound I cannot adequately describe. Not a scream, not a cry, but a sustained exhalation. A pushing out of air from the lungs that lasted longer than any breath should last, as if something were slowly compressing his chest. By the time I reached his tent, he was sitting upright in his sleeping bag, eyes open, face slack, making no sound at all. He had emptied. Whatever had been in him that made him Paul Duran had stepped out of the room. Aaron went to assess Paul, and 30 minutes into the assessment went silent mid-sentence. He was describing Paul's pupil response to Miguel, who was holding the headlamp. And the sentence stopped the way a recording stops when you pull the tape, no trailing off, no slurring, just a clean cut between one word and the absence of the next. Aaron sat down on the ground next to Paul's tent and put his hands in his lap and looked south. They all looked south, every one of them. Whatever was in that drainage was south of our camp, and they all knew exactly where it was, and they could not stop orienting toward it. Miguel, Danny, and I sat together until dawn. None of us slept. The forest was silent, not the partial silence of the approach march, but a totality of silence that included the wind. The air was dead still. The temperature was 44 degrees. The sky was clear and the stars were out, and there was nothing moving in any direction for as far as I could see or hear. And beneath the silence, there was something else. Not a sound, but a pressure. A vibration below the threshold of hearing that I felt in my sternum and in the backs of my teeth. A frequency. A pulse. It came in intervals of approximately 4 seconds, and each pulse made the surface of the water in my canteen shiver. Miguel felt it. Danny felt it. Neither of them spoke about it. We sat in the silence and the pulse, and we waited for the sun. Before the helicopter came on the morning of the 21st, I had radioed at first light for a double evacuation. Danny Macklin said something that I did not understand at the time and that I have not stopped thinking about since. He was watching Paul and Aaron, who were sitting side by side on a log, facing south, hands in their laps, breathing in unison. Danny looked at them for a long time, and then said, quietly, as if he did not entirely mean for me to hear, "It's not keeping us out. It's keeping us away from what's underneath." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. He said he didn't know. He said it had just come to him in the night, while the pulse was running through the ground. And he didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was true. Paul and Aaron were evacuated at 08:15 on the morning of August 21st. The flight medic, a different one this time, a woman named Garza from the Mammoth Clinic, examined them in the meadow before loading them and told me her assessment was mass psychogenic illness, possibly triggered by isolation, altitude, and the stress of the anomalous sight conditions. She said it as if she were reading from a card. She did not look convinced by her own words. She told me I should consider extracting the remaining crew and marking the site for follow-up investigation. I should have listened to her. I had 3 crew members left myself, Danny Macklin and Miguel Reyes, and 4 days' supply remaining, and a clearing full of moved trees that I had not finished documenting, and a protocol that said a crew leader does not abandon a site until the site assessment is complete, or until conditions make continued operations unsafe. I did not consider our conditions unsafe. Nothing had physically threatened us. No one had been injured. The collapses were disturbing, but not in the field assessment framework I had been trained in. Dangerous. I had a medic's diagnosis, mass psychogenic illness, and a reasonable expectation that the 3 of us who remained were not susceptible. I was wrong about that. We were not unsusceptible. We were simply last. I am telling you this because I will not have another chance to say it to anyone who might write it down. I made the decision to stay. The decision to stay is the reason we saw what we saw on the 3rd night. I do not regret it, but I own it. On the afternoon of August 21st, I made a decision that I told myself was procedural, and that I now understand was something else, a compulsion to confirm what I already suspected but could not yet admit. I told Danny and Miguel that we would return to the clearing to complete our site documentation before hiking out to the extraction point the following morning. We packed light: cameras, notebooks, flagging tape, my diameter tape, and folding ruler. Miguel carried the radio. Danny carried the GPS. We left camp at 1300 hours and walked the quarter-mile south toward the clearing. We did not reach the clearing. At approximately 1340, Danny stopped and looked at his GPS unit. He turned it off and turned it on again. He showed me the screen. According to the GPS, we were standing at the exact coordinates of our camp, the position we had left 40 minutes earlier. We had been walking due south on a compass bearing of 180 degrees for 40 minutes, and the GPS said we had not moved. I took out my compass. The bearing read 180. We had not deviated. The terrain under our feet had been climbing gently, consistent with the drainage's south to north fall line. We had been walking uphill, which meant south, which meant toward the clearing. The GPS was wrong, or the GPS was right, and something I could not explain had happened to the relationship between where we were and where the satellite said we were. Miguel said nothing. He was looking at the trees. I looked at the trees. The trees were wrong. It took me longer than it should have to understand what I was seeing, because what I was seeing should not have been possible, and the mind resists impossibility even when impossibility is standing in front of it in broad daylight. The lodgepole pines around us, the ones we were walking through, the ones that lined the approach from camp to clearing, were not the same trees we had walked through that morning. They were repositioned. The same type of displacement I had documented at the clearing root balls exposed. Soil fresh, vertical claw gouges on the trunks, but now surrounding us in a rough perimeter approximately 120 yards in diameter. The trees had moved overnight. Not the 14 around the clearing. New ones, dozens of them, arranged in a second circle larger than the first, centered not on the lightning strike site, but on our camp. I stood in the middle of that perimeter, and I felt the ground shift beneath my understanding of what was happening to us. The clearing had been a curiosity, a site anomaly, an unexplained displacement pattern, something for a report. This was different. This was responsive. Something had observed where we slept and built a boundary around it while we were sleeping. And it had done this by pulling full-grown trees out of the ground and replanting them upright without making a sound that any of the three of us had heard. Danny walked to the nearest repositioned tree and looked up at the claw marks. They were at the same height as the ones at the clearing, 15 to 20 feet. He looked at the root ball. He looked at the crater where the tree had been. He looked at me and said, "Same spacing, same grip, same hands." Miguel walked the perimeter. I watched him pace it. He moved with a deliberateness that told me he was not surveying. He was measuring, and he was measuring not for documentation, but for recognition. He completed the circuit in about 8 minutes and came back to where Danny and I were standing. "There's a gap," he said. "North side, about 30 feet wide. It faces the trail toward the Slough Creek trailhead." I walked to the gap. Miguel was right. The perimeter of repositioned trees was continuous, except for a single opening on the north side, the side that faced away from the clearing, away from the deeper drainage, and toward the trail that would take us out of the forest and down to the trailhead, 11 miles to the north. The gap faced the exit. I stood in that gap, and I looked south through the perimeter of moved trees toward the interior of the drainage. And I looked north through the gap toward the trail that led out. And I understood something that I'd been refusing to understand since we arrived. We were not being trapped. We were being shown the door. I took out the notes I had made from Miguel's account of the firekeeper, the one who tends the burning ground. It does not take. It tends. I thought about the Hayden File that I would not discover for another 8 years, the document that said, "Do not engage." It will manage the contact. I did not have the Hayden File's language then, but I had the shape of it. I had the pattern. 1923. A team enters, encounters the entity, withdraws without injury. 1951. The same. 1978. The same. 2003. The same. No casualties, no violence. Just a boundary, enforced not with teeth, but with architecture. Something in the upper Slough Creek drainage had been maintaining a perimeter for at least 80 years. And it maintained that perimeter by moving the forest itself. And every time human beings crossed that perimeter, it did not attack them. It showed them the way out. I told Danny and Miguel we were leaving, not in the morning, now. We packed nothing. We left the camp standing tents, supplies, everything. We walked north, through the gap, and we did not look back. That was 1,500 hours on August 21st. The trailhead was 11 miles north. We had 5 hours of daylight remaining and headlamps for the rest. I calculated we could reach the trailhead by midnight if we maintained a pace of 2 miles per hour, which was conservative for the terrain. We did not reach the trailhead by midnight. We did not reach the trailhead until 13:40 the following afternoon, August 22nd, because of what happened on the trail that night. We moved north at a steady pace through the rest of the daylight hours. The silence in the drainage persisted. No birds, no squirrels, no insects, no elk. But the subsonic vibration I had felt the night before was absent, or at least I could no longer detect it. The air was still warm, mid-60s, and the sky was clear. And the forest was exactly what a lodgepole forest in northern Yellowstone should be, except that nothing was alive in it except the three of us and the trees. Miguel led. I walked second. Danny walked rear. We did not speak for the first 2 hours. The silence in the forest made human speech feel intrusive, not forbidden exactly, but noticed. I had the persistent and irrational sensation that sound traveled differently in this drainage, that words spoken aloud went further than they should, and were received by something that was not part of the conversation. I did not share this sensation with the others. I did not need to. Miguel was walking with his head slightly tilted, the way a man walks when he is listening to something he cannot identify. Danny was walking with his hands open at his sides, not tense, not clenched, but ready, in the way that a man's hands are ready when his body knows something his mind has not yet admitted. At approximately 1930 hours, with the light failing and the shadows in the timber merging into a general darkness, broken only by the last gray of the sky above the canopy, I turned on my headlamp. Danny and Miguel did the same. 3 beams of light in the darkness pointed north, following a game trail that threaded through the lodgepoles on a gentle downslope toward the Slough Creek drainage bottom. At 20:15, Miguel stopped. He did not say anything. He just stopped walking and stood in the trail, and Danny and I stopped behind him, and the 3 of us stood in the darkness with our headlamps on, and listened to Miguel not speaking. Then Miguel raised his arm and pointed to the left, west, into the timber. I looked where he was pointing. My headlamp beam reached about 40 feet into the trees before the light dissolved into shadow and trunk. I saw nothing. Lodgepole pine, standing dead timber, deadfall on the ground. The usual tangle of a mature forest at night. Then something moved. I will be as precise as I can. At a distance I estimated as 80 to 100 feet from the trail, in the timber to our west, something tall, taller than the surrounding trees, shifted its weight. That is the most accurate description I can give. It was not a step. It was not a lean. It was a redistribution of mass. The way a man standing in one place shifts from one foot to the other. And it caused the silhouettes of the 3 standing dead lodgepoles in my line of sight to change their positions relative to each other. Something behind them, or among them, or above them, had moved. And the movement was lateral, and the scale of the displacement was wrong. The dead trees that shifted were 50 to 60 feet tall. Whatever moved behind them was at least that height. because the displacement extended to the tops of the trunks. I told myself it was a snag, a standing dead tree, compromised at the root, leaning in the night breeze. I told myself this even though there was no breeze. The air had been dead still since sundown. I told myself this because the alternative was to accept that something 60 feet from the canopy floor was standing in the timber 80 feet away from me, and that it was alive, and that it had been there waiting, watching, standing, for as long as we had been walking, and possibly longer. My headlamp was not strong enough. The beam reached 40 feet, and the thing was at 80. And all I had was shape and movement, and the sound that came next, a low, drawn exhalation, like air moving through a space that was too large for lungs, a sound that had no analog in my experience of wildlife. Not bear, not elk, not bison, not anything. It was the sound of something enormous breathing out, and the breath lasted 4 or 5 seconds. And when it ended, the silence that followed was heavier than the silence before it. Danny reached forward and put his hand on my shoulder. Not gripping, resting. The weight of his hand was the only thing that kept me from running. Miguel had not moved. He was still pointing into the timber, but his arm was shaking not with fear, I think, but with the effort of pointing at something his body did not want to acknowledge was there. I saw the eyes. 2 points of light, low orange, the color of embers in a fire that has been banked for the night, positioned approximately 25 to 30 feet above the ground, spaced about 3 feet apart. They were not reflecting my headlamp. They were generating their own light. I know the difference. I have seen eyes shine from elk, from deer, from bears, from mountain lions. Reflected light has a quality of dependency. It exists only in the beam. These did not. I moved my headlamp to the side, breaking the beam angle, and the points of light remained, steady, fixed, regarding us from a height that put them above the lower canopy. They did not blink. I do not know how long we stood there. Danny says it was 2 or 3 minutes. It felt like the length of a season. The orange points of light held their position, and the thing that held them did not move again, and the silence was total. And I understood that I was being watched by something that had seen me long before I had seen it, and that it was standing in the timber on the west side of the trail, which was the side deeper into the drainage, and that it was not standing between us and the trail north. It was not blocking our exit. It was standing to the side in its own territory, and it was watching us leave. I said very quietly, "We're going." Not to Danny, not to Miguel, to the eyes. We walked. We did not run. We kept our headlamps pointed forward on the trail, and we walked north at a pace that was faster than safe for the terrain in the darkness. And we did not look west again. Behind us, or beside us, or above us, I could not tell. I heard the sound of something very large moving through timber in the same direction we were moving, not toward us, parallel to us, keeping pace. The sound was not footsteps in any way I could recognize. It was the sound of trees being displaced, the creak of trunks bending, the muffled crack of deadfall compressed under weight, a rhythm of impact that was spaced too far apart for a walking animal and too close together for a falling tree. It accompanied us for approximately 20 minutes. Then it stopped. The sounds ceased. The orange lights, when Danny risked a single glance to the west, were gone. But we were not alone. I knew that with absolute certainty. Whatever it was had not left. It had simply stopped being audible. It was still there, in the darkness, in the timber, moving with us or ahead of us or around us in a way that did not require sound. We kept walking north. We did not stop. We did not speak. At approximately 01:30 on the morning of August 22nd, on a section of game trail that followed a muddy bench above a creek tributary, under a moon that had risen above the eastern ridge and was casting the forest in a blue-white light that made every shadow absolute, we came around a stand of Douglas fir, and the trail ahead of us was occupied. I need to slow down here. I need to tell this the way it happened, which was slowly, because the mind does not process something like this all at once. The mind processes it in pieces, and each piece takes time, and the time between pieces is filled with a silence that is not empty, but full of the effort of comprehension, full of the distance between what you know to be possible and what is standing in front of you. The first thing I saw was the antlers. They were above the canopy. The Douglas fir on this section of trail were 60 to 70 feet tall, and the antlers were above them, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and they were moving a slow, lateral drift, like the mast of a ship turning in harbor. They were not elk antlers. I have counted elk in Yellowstone for 19 years, and I know every configuration of every age class of bull elk that walks this park. And these were not elk antlers. They were too wide. I estimated the spread at 8 to 10 feet. They were too dense, not the clean, branching tines of a cervid rack, but a mass of irregular points. Asymmetrical, some curving forward and some curving back, some broken, some intact, as if they had been growing for longer than any antlers should grow and had never been shed. The antlers turned. They oriented toward us. And then the thing that carried them stepped forward, out of the tree line, and onto the trail. And the moon was behind it, and above it, and the light fell on it. And I saw it. I saw it. I am trained to observe. I do not exaggerate. I have measured what I have seen, and I have verified my measurements against the known heights of the trees that framed it. And I am telling you what I measured. It stood between 25 and 30 feet tall. It was bipedal, 2 legs, 2 arms, an upright posture that was not quite vertical, slightly hunched at the shoulders, the way a very tall man might hunch to pass through a doorway that he has passed through many times. Its body was skeletal, not thin, skeletal. I could see the ribs, not the suggestion of ribs under skin, but the ribs themselves, pale in the moonlight, curved and distinct, with spaces between them where the moonlight passed through. The shoulders were broad, disproportionately so, and the arms hung past what would have been the knees, ending in hands. And they were hands, not paws, not hooves, but hands with elongated fingers, 4 that I could count, each terminating in a curved claw that caught the moonlight with an edge that looked less like keratin and more like stone. The skull was not a face. It was a skull, bone white, elongated, with a jaw that hung slightly open, and in the sockets of that skull, the same low orange light I'd seen in the timber hours before. The antlers rose from the top of the skull and spread outward and upward, and up close, if 80 feet can be called close, I could see that they were not clean bone. They were covered in something fibrous, dark, like dried moss or decayed velvet, hanging in strips that moved in air that was not moving. It stood on the trail. It filled the trail. The trail was 8 feet wide at that point, and the creature's stance, feet planted, arms at its sides, shoulders squared, occupied all of it. Behind it, the trail continued north toward the trailhead. The creature was between us and the way out. I stopped walking. Danny stopped beside me. Miguel stopped behind me. Danny had a flashlight and a handheld spotlight he had been carrying since dusk, and he raised it without thinking, and pressed the switch, and the beam hit the creature's torso at center mass, and the light that came back was the flat gray white of bone. The creature did not flinch. It did not react to the light. It looked down at us from a height that put its skull approximately 25 feet above our heads, and the orange light in its eye sockets did not change in intensity or direction, and its jaw did not close, and it did not move. I dropped my tools, my Pulaski, my radio, my pack. I did not decide to drop them. My hands simply opened, and they fell. Danny kept the spotlight up. Miguel was behind me, and I could hear him breathing, a measured, deliberate breath pattern that I recognized as a man controlling his fear through discipline. The creature looked at us. I do not know how to describe what it is like to be looked at by something that old and that large and that close. It was not the way a predator looks at prey. I have been charged by a grizzly sow in the Hayden Valley. I know what a predator's gaze looks like. The focus, the narrowing, the calculation of distance and effort. This was not that. This was the gaze of something that has been standing in this drainage for longer than my country has existed, and has seen men come into its territory before, and has seen them leave before, and is waiting with a patience that is not patience, but simply duration, for us to understand what every other team understood, that we were leaving, that it was allowing us to leave, that the allowing was not generosity, it was governance. 90 seconds. Danny says 90 seconds. I cannot confirm or deny. I experienced it as a single moment without duration, a moment that contained everything: the rib cage and the antlers and the orange light and the clawed hands and the skull and the silence and the moon behind it all and the mud under my boots and the sound of Miguel breathing and the weight of my own heartbeat in my throat. Then the creature moved. It did not step backward. It did not retreat. It turned a slow, deliberate rotation of its entire body, the antlers sweeping through the lower branches of the Douglas fir on either side of the trail, snapping limbs with a sound like rifle shots. And it faced north, the direction of the trailhead, the direction of the way out. And it walked. It walked north, up the trail, with a stride that covered 12 to 15 feet per step, and the ground shook with each footfall, not the subsonic vibration of the previous nights, but a physical, structural impact that I felt through the soles of my boots. And it did not look back at us. It walked and we followed. I did not decide to follow. My legs moved. Danny's legs moved. Miguel's legs moved. We followed the creature up the trail at a distance of approximately 40 yards, and it walked ahead of us, and the moonlight was on its back, and I could see the spine, each vertebra distinct, the size of a man's fist, articulating with a fluidity that was not mechanical but organic, alive, terribly alive, and the antlers swayed with each step, and the strips of dark fiber hanging from them moved like curtains in a room where the windows have been opened. It guided us for approximately 11 minutes. I know this because Danny, in an act of professionalism that still astonishes me, checked his watch when the creature started walking and checked it again when it stopped. 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, at its stride length, it covered approximately 1.5 miles. We covered the same distance at a jog, breathing hard, never gaining on it, never falling behind. At the end of the 11 minutes, the creature stopped. It stood on the trail for a moment, 3-4 seconds, and then it stepped off the trail to the west, into the timber, and it was gone. Not gradually, not by degrees. It stepped between two standing lodgepoles that should not have had room for it between them, and it was gone. And the forest was a forest again, and the moon was the moon, and the trail was a trail. And my crew and I were standing alone in the darkness. I looked at my GPS. It was working again. It showed our position as 2.4 miles south of the Slough Creek trailhead. We had been 11 miles from the trailhead when we started walking the previous afternoon. The creature had not only guided us north, it had guided us through terrain that should have taken 10 hours in a fraction of that time. Either we had been moving much faster than I believed, or the distance in that drainage does not work the way distance works everywhere else. Danny turned off the spotlight. We stood in the dark. The moon moved behind a cloud and came out again. A bird called it the first animal sound I had heard in 3 days. A great horned owl, somewhere to the east. 2 low hoots that sounded like the forest, remembering how to speak. Miguel said, "We should go." We went. We walked the remaining 2.4 miles to the trailhead in silence, arriving at first light. We sat on the split rail fence by the trailhead register and waited for the sun to come fully up, and none of us spoke. And when a pair of day hikers arrived at 0800 and asked if we were all right, Danny Macklin said, "Yes, ma'am," and that was the first word any of us had spoken in 6 hours. I radioed dispatch at 0830. I reported the crew's position. I reported that the remaining 3 crew members were ambulatory and uninjured. I did not report what we had seen. I did not describe the creature. I did not mention the moved trees, the collapses, the perimeter, the orange eyes, the 11-minute walk, or the owl. Dispatch asked me to confirm that the fire was out. I confirmed. Dispatch asked me to confirm that all crew members were accounted for. I confirmed 4 evacuated, 3 at the trailhead. Dispatch told me a vehicle would be at the trailhead by 1400 and that I should prepare a written incident report. I never wrote the report. I am 61 years old. I am recording this from the VA Medical Center in Billings, Montana, on a device that my daughter brought me because she does not know what I'm using it for. And I'm running out of time to say what I need to say. So I will say it plainly. 7 men entered the upper Slough Creek drainage on August 19, 2003. 3 walked out. 4 were carried out. No one was physically injured. No one bled. No one died. And not one of the 7 was the same person when he came out as when he went in. And that includes me. Paul Duran took medical retirement in 2004. He lives in Bozeman. He does not go into the backcountry. Keith Oberlin transferred to a desk position at the regional office in Denver and has not touched a chainsaw since. Joseph Waits. My Sawyer, the man who could not stop talking, left the Park Service entirely and moved to a town in Nebraska where, as far as I know, he still does not speak to anyone. He does not have to. Aaron Pruitt stayed in fire for another 2 seasons before his wife told me, in a phone call I did not ask for, that he had not slept through the night since August 2003, and that he screamed in his sleep. The word he screamed was there. Danny Macklin is the only one I still speak to. Danny is 44 now, a district ranger in Olympic National Park, and he has never discussed what happened in that drainage with anyone except me. When I told him I was recording this testimony, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Tell them it wasn't angry, Hale. Tell them it was just old." Miguel Reyes returned to the Crow Reservation after the 2003 season and did not come back to the Park Service. I visited him once in 2007 at his grandfather's house in Lodge Grass. He invited me in and gave me coffee, and we sat on his porch and looked at the Bighorn Mountains, and neither of us talked about the drainage. When I got up to leave, Miguel said, "It was tending, Thomas. That's all it was doing. We were in the way of the tending." The Hayden File. The 1978 Biological Exclusion Protocol is still classified as an unverified internal draft by the National Park Service. The upper Slough Creek drainage is still closed to public access. The closure is still listed as resource management. The Landsat thermal monitoring grid still covers that drainage, and as far as I've been able to determine, no fire crew has been dispatched there since 2003. The pattern held: 1923, 1951, 1978, 2003. 4 contact incidents in 80 years. 0 casualties. Whatever is in that drainage has been enforcing the same boundary for at least a century, and it has never killed anyone. And the Park Service knows this. And the Apsaluk knew it long before the Park Service existed. And none of them, not the government, not the tribe, ever felt the need to explain it. They simply stayed out. They respected the boundary. They let it tend. I did not respect the boundary. I did not know the boundary existed. I walked into that drainage because a satellite told me there was a fire, and the fire was out when I got there because something had already tended it. And the thing that tended it moved my trees and broke my men and walked me out of its home on a night in August when the moon was up and the elk were gone, and the only sound in the world was its footsteps on the trail ahead of me. It was not the predator. It was the fence, and we were being moved to the other side of it. I have one more thing to say, and I'm saying it because Danny Macklin told me I should, and because it is the part I have not been able to explain and do not expect to explain, and have stopped trying to explain. On the night of the 22nd, when we were back at the snow lodge, and the other crew members were at the Mammoth Clinic, and Danny and Miguel and I were sitting in a room that had electric lights and running water and walls between us and the forest, Danny asked me if I had noticed the gap in the tree perimeter. The gap that faced north, the gap that faced the exit. I said I had. Danny said, "It left that gap before we decided to leave. It was open when we found it. It knew we would go north before we knew." I have thought about that every day for 20 years. The gap was already there. The door was already open. Before I gave the order to leave, before I even understood that we needed to leave, something in that drainage had already built us a way out and left it standing open. It knew. 7 went in. 7 came out. The arithmetic is clean. But the men who came out were not the men who went in. And the drainage is still closed, and the boundary still holds, and the thing that holds it is still there, tending the burning ground. And it does not need us to believe in it. It does not need anything from us at all. My name is Thomas Hale. I was a crew leader. I am a dying man in a room in Billings. And the last true thing I know is this: we were let go.